I'm Richard Taylor from the Philosophy Department at Marquette University, and together with my colleague Andrea Robilio at the Catholic University in Leuven, we present to you this course on Thomas Aquinas on Metaphysics in fall of 2013. This is video lecture 9B, the second of two for class number 9. And our concern here today with this particular lecture will be on the commentary on the sentences, Book 2, Distinction 1, Question 1, Article 2, whether anything can go forth, ex ire possit, from God into being by creation. So let's proceed. In this article, Aquinas, again, as we've already seen, draws heavily on the thought of Avicenna, as we've seen in other works as well. But other philosophers are brought into the discussion. Pardon me. Other philosophers are brought into the discussion, so to speak, when Aquinas interestingly spells out a conception of creation which he says all the philosophers have asserted. This raises something of the issue of just what creation is, and whether there are several species of creation, whether there is a creation which is not ex nihilo, whether God's creation must necessarily be a creation ex nihilo, and related issues as well, and whether the metaphysical sense of creation is one or there are a plurality of species of it. It's a rather interesting question, and we'll have to see how Aquinas handles that. I think there's some interesting implications for what Aquinas has to say, but we'll get into that a bit later. So here, let's begin then. Here Aquinas begins with his responsio by indicating that creation is not just a matter of faith, but something reason demonstrates. And he's very firm about this in the beginning of this article, in his response, I mean. He's very firm about this, and he wants to proceed on the basis of reason. So for this, he first proceeds with the reasoning of Aristotle from Metaphysics Book 2, or Alpha Eleton, which you'll recall is the first book of the Metaphysics in the Arabic tradition. That there is a first in every genus in which the perfect is found. And Aquinas proceeds then to relate it to participation. So again, this is that notion from Alpha Eleton that there's a first in any genus, and that the first principle of all things is very hard to see because it is intelligible in its own right, highly intelligible in its own right, or even most intelligible in its own right, but not so easily intelligible to us. There's a great deal of background that one could spell out regarding this, and also a great deal of influence of this particular article in medieval philosophy, but that's not our, this particular book of Aristotle's Metaphysics. Its influence on medieval philosophy is rather great, and it stirs up quite a number of interesting controversies, but perhaps that'll have to wait for another occasion. Let's proceed here then with Aquinas. He says, quote, "Since any given thing, and whatever is in the thing, participates being, esse, in some way, even if mixed with imperfection, it is necessary that everything, according to the whole of what is in it, arise from the first and perfect entity, ente. But we call this to create, namely to produce a thing in being according to its whole substance. Hence it is necessary that all things proceed from the first principle through creation." So here, this is he gives us a definition of creation: to produce a thing in being according to its whole substance. So this is not then to produce something on the basis of something presupposed, but the whole substance of something is produced in creation. Created being then, by implication then, created being participates uncreated divine being through creation, since all being comes from the first principle. But how does participation work in this case? Now, the reason I put that question in there is I want to call particular attention to this notion of participation in Aquinas. And I believe I've said something in class about this, but I want to reiterate it here, and that is that the notion of participation in Aquinas is complex and often ambiguous. And so each time I urge you that each time you see Aquinas speak about participation, that you set aside the metaphor of participation and consider what sort of causality he's talking about in each case. Because participation can certainly refer to a kind of formal or exemplar causality. It can refer to efficient causality. It can refer to final causality. So rather than just gloss over what kind of causality may be involved, I suggest that each time you see the term participation in Aquinas, you pause for a moment and think about precisely what kind of causality Aquinas may be thinking about. I think this will be extremely valuable in your reflections on Aquinas. This way, he doesn't slip anything by you, so to speak, or rather, you don't let anything slip by yourself in your understanding of what Aquinas means. So, again, be careful and be sure you understand what he means when he speaks about participation. And so, as I say here, definitions are important, and so Aquinas next provides an explanation of what is relevant to the nature of creation, that is, ad rationem creationis. Number one, quote, it presupposes nothing in the thing which is said to be created. So he's going to move very, very carefully here and explain exactly what he means by creation. So it is not generation presupposing matter and requiring form, and it is not accidental change that presupposes a substance as a subject for the accidents. Those do not involve everything in a thing. Those are if we presuppose matter or we presuppose a subject, then we don't properly have creation, according to Aquinas. Quote, but the causality of the Creator extends itself to all that is in the thing. So when the Creator creates, it has to do with all that is in the thing, with nothing presupposed in any way, shape, or form. And this follows quite precisely the account of Avicenna in Avicenna's Metaphysics. Number two, in the thing in which is said to be created, in the thing which is said to be created, non-being is prior to being, not by a priority of time or duration, so that earlier it was not and afterwards it is, but by a priority of nature, in such a way that if the created thing is left to itself, non-being would result. Close quote. Now, if you look carefully at the texts of Avicenna that were recommended for reading for our class on Avicenna on creation, you'd find that precisely these terms are raised by Avicenna to clarify the notion of creation in his own account. So, what does Aquinas mean here? Well, to put it another way, prior to the creation of a thing, there is nothing. Okay? Prior to creation, the thing to be created is nothing, and exists only in the power of the agent, not in some potential subject pre-existing the action of the Creator. So he's stressing very much so that there is nothing presupposed here for the notion of creation. Further, note that conservation is also involved, since Aquinas writes the following: if the created thing is left to itself, non-being would result. That, by the way, is almost a quotation from Avicenna's Metaphysics, very close to it. So the thing left of itself, it is nothing. So if the created thing is left to itself, non-being would result. And so it can't be left to itself, and what's required is conservation, or perhaps a kind of concurrentism as well. But certainly some kind of conservation is required for a thing to continue in existence. Is then creation the same as conservation? Interesting issue. Very interesting philosophical issue. But Aquinas' aim is to make it clear that it is in itself nothing. And again, this is from Avicenna's Metaphysics. This creation then is ex nihilo, from nothing, in two ways that need to be spelled out in detail. And Aquinas is trying to be extremely clear here. But he surely must almost have Avicenna's Metaphysics open on his desk. So number one, two things that need to be spelled out in detail. Number one, quote, one is such that the negation would negate the order of creation in regard to something pre-existing implied by the preposition from, or ex. Ex seems to indicate something pre-existing, but we want to put in the negation of that. That's what we mean by ex nihilo. It involves the negation of there being anything from which it is something is originated. He goes on, so that creation would be said to be from nothing because it is not from something pre-existing. That's Aquinas, okay. So that, and again, that's from Avicenna. So that is, there is absolutely no subject present in any way outside the Creator's power for the action to have as its focus. Put another way, creation is the thing created alone. So creation is the thing, and there's nothing there except the thing beforehand, and the only way that anything is present beforehand is the way that the Creator's power is present to the Creator. Otherwise, there is nothing there outside. Number 2, quote, the other is such that, Aquinas says, the other is such that the order of creation in regard to nothing pre-existing would remain affirmed by nature, so that creation would be said to be from nothing because the created thing naturally has non-being prior to being. Close quote. But of course, we have to be careful about our language here. This notion that the created thing naturally has X, has something, has non-being prior to being? No. While grammar allows for the use of the noun non-being, its referent is pure negation. And so the it is nothing at all, purely negated. So the nature of a created thing considered in itself is nothing at all prior to creation. We may refer to it in this way, but it is nothing. There is nothing there prior to creation. And again, here Aquinas provides a simplified account from his source Avicenna. You'll recall that Hauser, in his piece on the De Ante Essentia, then stresses that what Aquinas is providing is in fact simplified versions of arguments from Avicenna. It's at this point of his response that Aquinas makes a curious remark. He says the following, if these two suffice for the notion of creation, then creation can be demonstrated in this way, and in this way the philosophers have asserted creation. Again, if these two criteria suffice for the notion of creation, and Aquinas seems to assert that, then creation can be demonstrated in this way. So number one, it can be demonstrated, and further, in this way, the philosophers have asserted creation. This seems rather remarkable to me. So here Aquinas gives recognition to the account of Avicenna as an account of creation. That much is quite clear from our studies of Avicenna earlier. But Aquinas says the philosophers, and this would seem to have to include both Aristotle and Averroes. Now, among students of Aquinas, there's been some controversy regarding whether Aquinas always attributed creation to Aristotle. The work of my Marquette University colleague Mark Johnson on this has been rather valuable, and he's shown that in fact Aquinas does this, attributes creation to Aristotle. For a detailed discussion of this issue and its meaning, take a look at Lawrence de Wannes' Thomas Aquinas, Creation and Two Historians, Laval Théologique et Philosophique, Volume 50, 1994, and pages 363 to 387, and the literature cited there by de Wannes. So, while there's controversy among the students here, it seems clear that, about the students of Aquinas, that is, it seems clear that Aquinas does in fact hold this view in accord with his understanding of Aristotle. So Aristotle taught creation in some way. However, I want to ask the question about Averroes. We've already looked at Averroes on creation, and the question I have is, does the doctrine of Averroes on creation fit the criteria that Aquinas provides? Surely Averroes is included under the title or the term the philosophers, quote unquote. Earlier, we did have readings on creation, so it's worthwhile to take this up perhaps in class discussions. We do know that Averroes himself rejects creation ex nihilo, that much is clear. But it raises the interesting point of whether that means that Averroes rejects creation. That is a proper conception of creation one that is necessarily ex nihilo? Or is there a conception of creation on the part of God that is not ex nihilo? And precisely what does that mean? As you know, Averroes completely rejects the notion of a causation by efficient causality, a causation that is created by efficient causality on the part of God, because he says that separate substances or immaterial entities don't have any efficient causality, because efficient causality for Averroes has to do with motion. Rather, those entities can only act through final causality. Immaterial entities can only act through final causality. And so God can only be a final cause for things in the world. And again, you recall, he does so by drawing things into existence and unity as they seek to imitate the highest instance of being qua being, namely God. Does Averroes' conception of creation meet the criteria spelled out here by Aquinas? This is something worthy of talking about in class, I think. And further, are creation and conservation one and the same thing? Now, what I have in mind here is to raise this issue. If an analysis of creation and conservation indicate that they are the same thing, and we find that sort of analysis in Quinn's article that I put in the recommended reading, then is Averroes' concept of conservation as set forth in his Metaphysics appropriately then considered a conception of creation? If the two are identical, that would seem to be the case. Well, at any rate, I want to raise the issue and not solve it here. But Aquinas then goes on to mention a third view, and he says this, quote, "However, if we take a third consideration to be required for the notion of creation, so that in duration the thing created has non-being before being, so that it is said to be from nothing because it is temporally after nothing, then creation cannot be demonstrated in this way, nor is this conceded by the philosophers, but it is supposed by faith." So this is really quite important. Of course, this precedes his discussion in the short treatise De Aeternitate Mundi, on the eternity of the world, his discussion of whether it's possible for there to have been an eternal creation. Not that there was an eternal creation, but whether it's possible. And regarding this and the conception of creation put forward here, I recommend you have a look at the piece by Luis Lopez Farhat that was indicated on the course detailed syllabus page for class number 7. And this was just recently published on precisely this particular issue. Finally, for his responses to the first three objections, Aquinas again draws on the account of creation provided by Avicenna. Here I just want to call your attention to the doctrine of the 5 causes, or that of the two sorts of efficient causes set out by Avicenna and recounted in the response to objection 1 by Aquinas. Avicenna speaks of a natural agent, cause, involving motion and potency, and a divine creative agent, cause, involving the reception of being by something newly made without passive potency, nothing pre-existing, without passive potency, but only through the active potency of the agent, God. And this is precisely what Aquinas recounts here then in his response to the first, that there are 2 senses of efficient cause. One is the cause of motion, and it presupposes the existence of a subject, and the other is a subject that would be receptive of it, and then the other is another sense. It might be even called a 5th cause, as I think Albert calls it, a 5th cause which involves a divine creative agent, creating something ex nihilo. And notice the phraseology that he uses here, involving the reception of being by something newly made. But of course, there is nothing there to receive being beforehand. So it's the bringing about of something through the active power of the Creator, without there being any kind of passive potency present. Well, I think this lecture and the previous one are enough to stimulate some of our discussion about the assigned materials for the week, and so I will pause here and see you in class on Thursday.